think I'll call the meeting to order. Good evening, everyone. How are you doing? Okay. Long time. It feels like forever since we've been together. So it's great to see everyone. So tonight we have another change to our dance card. We had hoped to have some guests from Chittenden East to talk about their experience tonight. We had some scheduling challenges, and the financial folks were good enough to switch up with them. So this week we'll be obviously focused on the financial questions, finances of the districts. And then next meeting we will have the CESU folks, and then a moderated conversation about communication and community engagement with Liz Subin. She's offered to moderate committee discussion and possibly some small breakout groups about how we want to communicate and engage with the community moving forward. And I think that those two presentations together will make a lot of sense, especially when we get to hear firsthand the experience that another community went through, and maybe learn a little bit about how they went about communicating the work that they did. So the first item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from April 8th. Do I have a motion? Thank you. Is there a second? Any edits or changes to the minutes? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Approval of minutes carries. Thank you. Thank you all again for your feedback after each meeting. It's very helpful for Brian and I as we put together the agenda and plan the meetings so that we can have productive time together. Even if you get me your feedback late, that's okay. So keep it coming. Brian, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just to make sure that when people looked at what we had from last time, you had those highlighted areas, which was the summaries from the three small group activities. And again, I think it also has value to you as we continue to have the discussion, particularly next week or the next meeting around the community engagement, to make sure that the questions that you are acknowledging are questions that you want to have answered as you go forward are items that are being addressed as we get further along with this process.
Are there any other agenda items that people would like to see on the agenda before we move forward? Any other things that people would like to address tonight? The focus of tonight, and I think it's appropriate given the fact that it's such a big part of this conversation, is about the financial implications of consolidation. So I think it's very appropriate that we spend a lot of time on this topic, and so we've got our esteemed guests here to give us a presentation, and we have a ton of data, as you saw on the website, hopefully just a whole lot of data. So tonight is definitely an opportunity to hear some of the information that the group has brought forward, but also to ask lots of questions. We might not have all the answers to the questions tonight, but it would be a great time to begin to capture some of the questions that we have so that we can then pursue answers after this meeting. So I think that would be something we want to make sure we capture perhaps in the minutes as part of the meeting as we move forward. Any questions or clarifications at this point? Great. Well, I would like to welcome Grant Geisler, Deb Anderson, and Roger George. They are here to talk about finance, operations, HR, enrollment, demographics, tax implications, the whole ball of wax. So I'm more than happy to hand it off to you for a presentation, and then I'll moderate some questions afterwards.
All right, well, good evening, everybody. We only have about 16 slides or so, so we tried to keep it real brief. We're going to run through this, and there should be plenty of time for questions. We did put a lot of information in backup slides, and a lot of other information is posted on the website. So we'll just get started. We've already been introduced, Deb, Roger, myself. In the backup, we have our pieces of the organizational charts and kind of a description of what our duties are, if you wanted to look at that later. And I decided I was going to start out with a bit of a spoiler alert, just so you're not wondering half an hour into this. All three of us are in favor of a red, just to get that out of the way. So there's answer number one. And I think it's significant to know that we're in favor of it, even though we realize all three of our positions likely won't exist in a red, and we will be the ones that will have some of the fun with some of the challenges for a transition. So even though we know those things, we're still in favor. So we're going to address several of the essential questions that you had come up with, and we didn't want to define all of those, so those are also in the backup slides if you want to go and kind of refresh your memory on what the essential question was. In backup, we also have a slide on Affordable Care Act if you wanted to kind of dig into that. Data sheets, we have data sheets for each district, and we are going to combine that onto one data sheet so you have one piece of paper that has all the data information. We were just reconciling how we came up with the numbers, and so as soon as Roger finishes tweaking, he's going to send that information to me, and then instead of having 4 separate data sheets on the website, there'll just be one. There's also information on assets and long-term debt. And I'll pass it over for Roger to talk a few slides.
Thank you. Before I make other comments, I'm accompanied tonight by our accountant from the Essex Town Business Office. I'd like to introduce Carol Brouillard, who's here to help with some flashcards, help me answer questions. and one thing that Grant didn't need someone from the finance office. I guess you didn't either. Also, Grant neglected to mention that I'm just back to work. This is my second week back to work part-time after a few weeks away following some surgery. So any of the difficult questions tonight go to either of my neighbors. Have to be easy on me. So as we start now with the demographics, one of the essential questions asked each of our school systems rely on enrollment data as we begin our budgeting process. I know, at least speaking for Essex Town, the main number we want to see is the guesstimate for the incoming kindergarten class. We sort of assume the progression of other students through the grade levels, but that's an important number to have each year. Thanks to Grant Geisler for arranging the services of Kenneth Jones for providing those statistics for us for the current year. The slide mentions that there is a bit of a history of declining enrollment at Westford and the high school, but future projections are fairly stable in all of the districts, so we feel positive about that. And Grant already mentioned that detailed projections are available in your backup info. Next slide is also mine on differences and opportunities. Obviously, over time, the schools, while we all educate students, end up doing some things somewhat differently or face different situations. The first issue, school busing, with the town covering the large and somewhat rural area. Essex Town for years has provided busing to virtually all of our students, and we bring students to the high school also. EJ and the high school has a more specialized transportation program, so that's a key difference. It goes without saying that teachers' compensation and benefits were different systems, so there's differences in those agreements. Also, the support staff master agreements are not perfectly aligned. We'll later get into the fact under opportunities that while our agreements aren't perfectly aligned, they're not all that different in most cases, and we believe we have the experience and ability to help bring those together. Certainly, Deb has had some experience in that just within CCSU, so we think that the experience gained through that process would help if the two school districts merge. While we use many of the same carriers for insurance products or vendors for other goods and services, we might use some, or we might use different ones. I think in a lot of cases we use the same ones, and those where those similarities exist, that would be a positive opportunity for cost savings based on greater greater numbers. In terms of staffing structure, our central offices are configured somewhat differently. Again, we perform the same services in Essex Town, for example. We don't have a separate administrator for both HR and finance. That's a shared responsibility for me personally. There's some other differences in positions, but again, the same services are ultimately provided. We also mentioned as a difference, this Affordable Care Act affects the CCSU and its districts more so than Essex Town when you get into numbers of employees and individual employers and so forth, that certain places might be subject to penalties or different accounting issues. So we have that difference. That's another example of something that would be a easier system to manage if the schools were all combined into one merged district. So in terms of opportunities, which we'd like to keep our focus largely on the positive side of the ledger, again, as Grant said, we do see opportunities and think that all the things that are listed under opportunities, negotiation power, combined labor agreements, better alignment of vendors and insurance carriers, those are all things that we feel are achievable and very doable. Workers' compensation, and the smaller a school system is, if there is an injury or accident on the job that affects the experience modification, as the insurers call it, and the larger your pool of employers, the less one accident will affect your rate in the coming years. So there is that strength in numbers. We do believe, again, sort of with reference to the Affordable Health Care Act, that the next few bullets on insurance and maintaining the same insurance options and ability to increase premiums beyond levels that we previously understood, or excuse me, not premiums, but employee co-pays, that there would be advantages with under a larger employer. So, and lastly, we would cite the benefits of shared expertise between the various districts, and coming together, we would all benefit from that.
In terms of recruitment and retention, we looked at kind of each of those different audiences. You know, from our perspective, central office administration, at least from the CCSU perspective, because now we're working with 4 districts, we see it as being less complexity at the central office. And that will make those administrative positions more desirable when you're answering to one board versus 4 different boards who might see things a little bit differently, and how are you going to implement a set thing when 4 different boards want to do it differently. It also eliminates some of the redundancy for state reporting. Right now we have to do multiple reports, multiple budgets, things of that sort, where that would eliminate some of those redundancies and create greater economies of scale. It also allows for greater specialization. You know, CCSU on their own probably doesn't have enough capacity for a transportation coordinator, but combined there may be enough need for somebody who can specialize in that one thing, whereas each of us cannot do that. In terms of the school administrators, the red structure does allow for greater collaboration amongst the school leaders to provide more of the pre-K through 12 continuum for our students. And it also increases reassignment opportunities. Now, if we have, at least in the CCSU, we have the multiple districts. So if we have a principal in our Essex Junction School District and there's a high school position open, the board can't simply reassign folks if they feel that that's in the best interest of the system. That person would have to apply to the position at the high school, and if they're interviewed, and so forth. So there's greater flexibility and mobility of placement of the administrator, so it provides them with greater opportunity. In terms of the school and teachers and school staff, because we're not really looking at closing schools, we really don't see that there's going to be a large impact in terms of the number of staff that we're going to need. So we see them as being largely unaffected. So we don't see that as a big focus in terms of them being impacted. But the one thing that could happen is that students could be better distributed across the schools. We may have some schools now that have a much greater capacity to absorb students than others. Like our Summit Street School is kind of busting at the seams, if you will, with students. And if there are other schools with more capacity, you might be able to evenly distribute them and be able to fit them a little bit better within the whole structure. And that would help preserve some jobs in some of the schools as well. There's also more opportunity to share employees across schools, which means more opportunity for full-time positions. You know, our hardest struggle right now is trying to retain folks in part-time, well, actually trying to recruit and retain folks in part-time positions. So we struggle with that a lot at our Westford school, which has a lot of, you know, we don't really need a full-time, hardly anything besides classroom teachers, and it's really difficult to fill those slots, versus if you have a bigger system with multiple schools, you can share folks and maintain or retain or, you know, create full-time positions shared between them. So it'll provide greater opportunity for our part-time teachers. There's also greater opportunity for specialization and access to specialized staff. So right now, we're getting a math specialist in our Essex Junction School District. We have a literacy specialist in our high school, but they don't, because one's in one district and one's in the other, we can't share those resources. When you're all one, and I know Essex Town also has math specialists, so when you're all in one, you can share those resources across, and you may be able to create more opportunities for other opportunities as well. We have a literacy specialist that we budgeted, but our Title I funds didn't come out, so we really only have a part-time, and we probably won't be able to fill that now. And as a result of that, we're kind of losing out on that service that we really needed. But again, the bigger the system, the more likely we would be able to maintain or to create that specialization. There's also the potential for larger seniority groups for our teachers. You know, it all depends on what gets negotiated, but when you have more people in the same area, it creates better job security for those more senior staff. And they will be working under a different master agreement. It's not going to be one or the other. We're going to, you know, under the red, they're going to come up with a new one, and that could be good or bad. You know, some teachers may love it, some teachers may not like it. It depends really what gets negotiated, but that will be what's different for them. But they'll all be one, so that's a good thing. We continue. So for school board members, hopefully under the red, we would have fewer board members, which would be, right now we're having a difficult time filling board member slots. We had, I believe, a 30% turnover just within the CCSU of board members, and we still have one vacant position for an EJ rep on our U46 board. So we're really having trouble filling the slots that we have available. So hopefully in a red, you'll have fewer board slots available, which will make it easier to fill. Also, having the purview over a pre-K-12 continuum, I think, will make it more desirable. You know, if you want to be a board member because you kind of want to follow your child through school, but right now you really don't have that opportunity. You might start an EJ and then they're moving on to the high school, but now you're not in their school district anymore. You know, so this provides that continuum, and then you make decisions that affect the whole child pre-K-12 and not just their middle school, elementary, middle school, and then somebody else makes the decisions around the high school. So there'd be that continuity across it. So I think that would be more attractive to school board members as well. In terms of volunteers, the volunteers, and right now volunteers have to register with Essex Town, and then they also have to register with CCSU, and they may have the same students because they're going to the high school. You know, the Essex Town students go to the high school, so now they got to register with both. When you're one system, they just register once, and they could be approved for any of the schools that they want to volunteer in. And the same goes with the fingerprint supported background checks. For those volunteer positions that require it, right now they have to do it twice, and they're not even transferable. So it's not like we can do it and send them the results, or they can do it and send us the results. They have to do them twice, which means going down the sheriff's office, and it just takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of money involved in that as well. Substitutes, the same thing. We share a lot of substitutes, not all of them, but we do share a lot of substitutes, and right now they have to apply separately to each district. They got to meet with the reps from this, fill out all the paperwork, and then go to the other one and meet with them and fill out all the paperwork. So we think it would be more attractive to our subs. They fill out the paperwork once, and it's also better for us. We have a bigger substitute pool, so they might have subs that we don't currently have that now we might be able to access, and we have subs that they don't have that they can access. So I think it greatens our substitute pool, and it also makes it easier for them instead of having to apply to multiple districts.
Okay, back to me. There was an essential question on governance, and one of the pieces had to do with tax authority. And the only place where tax authority really is a question has to do with Essex Junction Recreation and Parks, because that's the only place where one of our boards sets a tax rate. You know, now the local boards don't have to set a tax rate. It's kind of done for us. I'm not going to get into that because there's a slide. I think the very last slide we're going to talk about goes more in depth on the recreation and parks. Tax collection was a piece of this question, and we don't see that changing. We think there's status quo would exist. The town of Essex collects for both Essex Junction and Essex Town. Westford would still collect for Westford. Clerks and moderators, we all elect clerks, we all elect moderators, so we'd only have to do that. We'd have one instead of three of each of those. The treasurer restructuring opportunity is a little more challenging. It says 1 versus 3. It's really 3 because one person is 2 different treasurers, so really it should be 1 versus 4. The Westford town treasurer acts as school treasurer. The town of Essex town treasurer acts as school treasurer. And then U46 elects a treasurer, and EJ appoints a treasurer. That's the same person currently. So right now we have 4 different treasurers in different kind of capacities. The duties are kind of different. So this would be kind of an opportunity to restructure that so you have one treasurer and we understand the roles and responsibilities better. All of the rest of these bullets, the other 6, basically all of those things would be under the purview of the red board. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just all of that would be part of the red board. I guess you could kind of look at it as good, because instead of multiple boards doing all the work, maybe repetitively, one board would be doing all of this. And so there would be no, maybe one board might be working against another one's initiatives on something, especially like with budget development. You'd see the whole picture and one board would have purview over it.
Yeah, that especially goes with negotiations. Sometimes we kind of step on each other's toes, where one district might negotiate a higher percentage than the other one was hoping to settle, but now there's a kind of that negative impact on that district, because now that's a comparable that they're going to use for future negotiations. So when you're all one, you're not going to work against each other in that way, that you're going to be consistent and it'll be the same increase, whatever it is.
The next slide continues with the issue of governance, dealing more with school boards. I'd like to have us drop down to the second bullet. As we were meeting before tonight's presentation, we got thinking that this really obviously is the thing that school boards, whatever model or style they use, school boards are all about wanting to maximize student growth and success. That's why all of us are in education, to help students, help kids do as well as they possibly can. So some of the other things that school boards need to do, regardless of the style of governance that they employ, is complying with certain federal and state requirements, being transparent to the community that they serve, being consistent and accountable. So that's what's important about school boards, however they go about doing their business. Going back to the first bullet, of course, there are certain required federal and state policies that all school boards need to deal with, and no need to read specifically through those. Now, if we get into the more general topic of what's in a name, it's certainly not a surprise to anyone in this room that Essex Town Schools, for a number of years now, 5 or 6 years, I believe, has used the policy governance form of school board structuring, where the boards within Chittenden Central use the more traditional school board setup. As the 3 of us have discussed in preparing for this meeting, though, call it what you want, all boards need to accomplish basically the same things, and even though one is called policy governance and the other traditional management, there are many similarities between the two, and we feel that from some experience that some of the differences in how boards go about their work might be the subject of experience within their boards and the direction and methodology of their superintendents too. So in general though, certainly focusing on outputs, we feel in Essex Town, for example, that our policy governance methodology causes the district to want to focus greatly on outputs, what students can and can't do, and other benchmarks that we're reaching, not necessarily focusing on the inputs. But that's not to say that a more traditional form of government or governance is light years away and doing things radically different. So we lastly said that there would be the opportunity to learn from one another. Certainly once the new red board would form, those certain decisions would have to be made, I would imagine, in fairly short order as to how they wanted to initially start approaching their work.
And I think the one thing we talked about a lot is that you have to have a lot of these policies. I mean, you have to have them, but we may not call them a policy. I mean, we might have a policy on unlawful harassment. Maybe it's a procedure in Essex Town. You know, it doesn't, that's the whole what's in a name. There are all of these things. You have to have policies or procedures or something documented on how you're going to do these things. So we may have different labeled things differently, but we do have to make sure that we have them all covered, and it gives us an opportunity to kind of cherry pick the best policies too. You know, if ours on unlawful harassment maybe is a little too wordy, maybe we'll pick, you know, we might recommend that we use Essex Town's version of it. But more on to a topic that might start getting the juices flowing, tax and cost savings. The equalized tax rate incentive, I think you are all familiar with the 8642 scenario, which is the equalized tax rate would be reduced 8 cents in the first year, 6 in the second, 4 in the third, 2 in the fourth. The note is, I think you've also been getting updates on H361 and the Senate's work. The Senate now has an accelerated schedule, so if you hit that window, they may go to a 5-year incentive at 10-10-864. We're not going to know how this plays out until it's all done and gets signed into law, and then we're going to have to find out the legal interpretation of everything. So I'm not sure which way it's going to be, but it's not bad news whichever way it goes. 8642 with $300,000 is awesome. 5 years at 10-10-864 is even awesomer. The only downside is that under the Senate's version, it kind of leads you to believe that maybe you'd only get one of the $150,000 grants instead of 2. But if you give me an extra year at 10 cents, I'll give the 150 back because it's worth a lot more. So just so you know, it's not bad news. It's good now. In my mind, it could get even better. And there's a couple of slides that go more into the tax rate calculation that I'll show in just a second. The third and fourth bullets, you know, I do a lot of thinking of, you know, from your perspective, might you think that you're getting a better deal out of a merger or a worse deal out of a merger? Well, I think everybody has something to gain in this. Westford avoids a tax spike related to the loss of equalized pupil hold harmless protection. Unfortunately, as it is right now, I think we're going to have a problem in FY17 because they are implementing it in FY17, even though we've been trying to get them to push it a year. But still, that hold harmless protection, if it goes away, is going to impact Westford for the next several years, and it would make a pretty big tax spike go up. As far as U46, we're still $1,000 away from the excess spending threshold, but that threshold is coming down again another 2% this year. So we're gonna get closer and closer to that. But under a red, we would be well below that threshold because it would be the consolidated spending per pupil. And even though U46 is kind of considered CCSU, that's that tax rate there impacts EJ and ET, regardless of which community you live in. Obviously, the last bullet, we've talked a lot about this, staffing, efficiency, economy of scale, those kind of savings. Well, I can't tell you the dollar amount that it is right now. I can tell you that I predict that it's going to be much more than any new costs might generate. We do know that transportation is going to be an increased cost if Essex Junction does start busing. That could be a significant cost increase in Essex Junction, but we'll have these savings to go off of. We also have things like crossing guards that we could help to offset the costs. But the bottom line is I think there's going to be more savings than costs. I feel very confident in saying that. I know you've seen this, but I wanted to make sure everybody's understanding it because I put it together, so it kind of made sense to me. But as I looked at it after about a week off, I realized, this could look a little confusing if somebody was looking for the first time. So what I did was each district is on here to calculate down what an equalized tax rate is. So like for Westford, in FY15, the equalized tax rate was $1.51.4. With Essex Junction and Essex Town, of course, you have to blend the pre-K8 rate with the 912 rate. So down below that chart, you can see what the blended rates are. Essex Junction's blended rate was $1.52.9. Essex Town was $1.52.2. What I wanted to point out on this is that whenever you start looking at comparisons, and once again, who benefits the most from a red, a lot of it's starting to rain good. A lot of the individual questions you might have, like related to debt and things like that, remember that all of that is factored into a tax rate. So really, to me, the most important thing you want to be looking at is tax rates. And in FY15, the lowest tax rate compared to the highest tax rate was only off by $0.015.
Yeah.
And if everybody gets an 8-cent tax break, everybody wins. It's not winners and losers. Everybody gets a significant savings if we get a merger and if we get to save 8 cents. So that far right column is what a red would have looked like in FY15. So the tax rate for a red would have been $1.52.4, which is kind of near everybody's tax rate, and you would reduce that by 8 cents. So the adjusted tax rate would have been $1.44.4. To put that into context, that first note says if Westford, instead of having a tax rate of $1.51.4, if they wanted to come in at $1.44.4, they would have had to cut $210,000 from their budget in order to achieve that tax rate. Another way to look at it is with that 8 cents reduction at $1.44, they could have added $210,000 to their budget and come in back at $151.4 again. So it's really a matter of how much would they have had to cut to get that lower rate, or how much could they have added with a tax incentive to have the same tax rate that they had originally. So anyhow, that's FY15. I did another chart just in case you're thinking, well, maybe FY15 was an anomaly. Well, FY16 is done again, and now you can see the difference between the lowest and the highest is 1.8 cents. So still within 1.8 cents of each other. And I will say that in both cases, Westford was the low, but I will also tell you that with losing hold harmless protection, Westford is probably going to be the high in FY17. So this is marked draft for a couple of reasons. One, Westford doesn't have a voter-approved budget yet. And two, the base tax rate on here says $1. Latest I heard, they're leaning toward 98 cents. It could be 98, 99, $1. So that's why this says draft, because there's still some numbers on here that aren't official. But if you look at that note, you'll see those numbers as far as the impacts are pretty similar. Instead of 210,000, it's 195,000. Instead of 1.8 what, 1.28 million, it's 1.3 million. Instead of 1.37 million, oh, never mind, it is 1.37 million. Also, to give you kind of, to do the math for you, if you add up those three numbers, you're talking in 1 year, $2.86 million that could have been added to get the same tax rate we had. If you assume that the same kind of math would work for next year, and instead of 8 cents, you get a 6-cent break, and then a 4-cent break, and then a 2-cent break, over that 4-year period of time, you're talking about a savings of over $7 million, or $7 million that could have been added back into the budget and given you the original tax rates. So it's very significant. If you look at the 10-10-864 scenario, then in 1 year, instead of 2.9 million, it's like 3.5 or 3.6 million. And instead of a 4-year at 7 million, it would be 5 years at almost $9 million. So it's a significant thing, this tax incentive.
In terms of our current, one of the questions, what about the current alignments and efficiencies? So right now, we do have some collaboration between the two entities, but it's kind of in spite of the governance structure. We have the opportunity to share staff between CCSU and ET, but it is Essex Town, but it is a little bit more cumbersome. Like there was one right now that we were working on for a physical therapist, but then you have to create a memorandum of agreement. You got to figure out who's going to hire the position, who's going to be paying for the benefits, how is the other one going to reimburse, and what about the job description? And there's all these different nuances that you have to try to work out and manage between the two. So all that administrative costs that would simply, you would hire the position, with the supervisor. So you would eliminate all of that administrative cost and the sharing if you were one. So yes, is it possible? Yes, with a lot of work behind it, it's possible. So making a red would eliminate the amount of work that's required to do that. And also in a red, all employees could be deployed by the red based on the changing student needs. So you have all of your staff in a pool, and you can allocate them as you want to at the various schools and in different capacities. So you have a lot more flexibility in how you're employing your greatest resources, which is your human resource within a school. Contracts and purchasing costs would also decrease due to economies in scale. The larger the organization, usually you get a better rate the bigger you are. So Essex Town might be paying a certain cost for a service, and we might be paying the same thing, but when you're together, likely it's not going to be the same as adding them together. It'll be less because we're bigger. You get greater economy of scale that way. Also, the ability, we've been through a unifying an agreement. We had 3 different teacher-master agreements and Chittenden Central Supervisory Union. And we were able to merge them, and we had, Westford's salary schedule was hugely different than Essex Junction and Union 46, and we were able to get them on that same schedule, and that was kind of a big. So it's possible. We even and EJ and U46 several years back, we revamped the entire salary schedule. So it's always possible, and even within the same percentage. Doesn't matter what percentage you want to come in at, there's a way to create the salary schedule. It can simply be you have certain columns and you place them at whatever step is going to give them a whatever percentage increase. We've done it 2 or 3 times already, and we can do it again, so it's entirely possible to get everybody on the same salary schedule. And really at this point, Essex Town and CCSU, the salary schedules are not vastly different. They're much more close than Westford was to EJ and U46 than they are right now. So there's definitely, we can do it. There's no issue. We can absolutely do it in whatever settlement you want to come in at. Also, we have common systems right now. We both are using an ASOP substitute management system. We both use School Spring recruiting tool, and we use GoalView for special ed database. We also have some common vendors for our health insurance. We're both on VHI right now. Our cafeteria plan. We both have a self-insured dental plan, although they're administered by different companies. They're both self-insured, so we can easily try to figure out what's the best deal and how we want to do that. So those are kind of the current efficiencies, or where we see some additional efficiencies that could happen as a result of a red. Oh, me too. Okay. Oh, yeah. They've continued on reporting requirements. So even for the federal and state reporting requirements, there's a number of reports, and I'm not going to go into them all, but they're all listed there. that are they're duplicated. So you have to do one for each and every district versus under a red, you would do them once. So you would save in terms of those reports. Also, the intergovernmental payments for special ed, subs. Right now, the Chittenden Central Supervisory Union employs all of the subs for Essex Junction, U46, and Westford. That saved us time instead of setting up each sub into 4 different districts and treating each one as 4 different employees. But now you have to figure out how you're going to allocate those costs to the corresponding district. So there's all of the kind of intergovernmental accounting that has to go into that. There are certain reports that it wouldn't change. The educator census, teacher staff survey, they're kind of reported by school, so we still have the same number of schools, so really those would not be impacted.
Parent and community connections. We felt that probably the most important bullet to focus on relative to this slide is the understanding budgets and tax rates. Certainly Essex Town residents, we do an annual report that explains our budget and taxes, but that doesn't include a lot of detail as to what's going on in the high school. We do emphasize the blended tax rate because ultimately that's what the resident will see on their tax bill, but they actually receive 2 different lines on their tax bill too. And it plays out similarly within the junction with different rates and that addition. We just feel that one document for the entire community that explained a pre-K-12 budget and one tax rate could be much more readily understood and perhaps get into more important issues as to how that budget was affecting students than trying to explain some of these nuances of numbers. We've mentioned before that that some of this talk of merger, tonight we're focusing a lot on the nuts and bolts of it, but again, we feel that ultimately that the combined program would be better for students, and I think that some of the other points of this slide addresses or speaks to that. The second bullet, no confusion over which superintendent or board to address. I don't know that the confusion is always great for everybody, but it certainly is for some of the residents, and we both can tell war stories of referring calls to one of the 2 central offices to the other, just beside or along with, or more important than referring calls to a different office, again, is the uniformity for children and the superintendent's outlook on dealing with school buildings and instructions given to principals and staff. If it was one merged district, there would be continuity in those instructions and thought process in working with the community and with students. Certainly there would be consistency that we feel would be helpful. We often lament in Essex Town that we're sending students to a high school where we're slightly larger than half of the enrollment, but decisions made in our middle school might not be exactly the same as decisions made in the Junction's middle school. Well, there would be that greater uniformity. So certainly we think that a unified message would be strengthened and probably appreciated by the community.
Okay, we only have 3 slides to go if you've been counting. Efficiencies of the red from a finance perspective. I think you've probably seen some of this. I know that Judy mentioned some of these data points. Going from 5 things to 1 thing. Budgets, audits, tax ID numbers, checking accounts, all the IRS reporting. Obviously going from 5 to 1 would make it a lot more efficient. I did have a caveat there for budgets. Technically it's not really 5 to 1, it's more 7 to 3, because we do have in CCSU a budget for the Center for Technology Essex and a budget for Rec Department. Those are two separate budgets. And even a red would likely have to still have those two budgets that would be separate. CTE, because they get their revenue from tuition, not from tax rates within the community. EJRP, because it's a municipal tax rate and it's program revenue. So just so if you hear somebody talk about 5 budgets or 7 budgets or 1 budget or 3 budgets, that's what that's all about. As Roger mentioned, a single vote, a single warning, a single annual report. Obviously, there's going to be savings in putting those together, getting them out, but also in understanding. I think Essex Town puts out a great annual report. It doesn't look like the ones I do, though. So if you're in Essex Town, you look at your pre-K8 annual report, it looks one way, and then if you grab my U46 annual report, it's going to look a little different. The language is going to be a little different. It may not really be transparent to you. And while we do collaborate a lot, I mean, we haven't just completely reinvented each other's wheels. So there is still going to be some of that lack of transparency until it's one. I put possible greater voter engagement because Roger keeps encouraging me to be optimistic. I will tell you, I don't think it could be worse. But I do think that if there's one budget and people understand it and they're going to one meeting instead of having to go to one location and one meeting and then a different location and a different meeting, that hopefully there would be better engagement. Act 153, that's a big concern for CCSU. Right now, we're getting waivers so that we don't have to bring all special educators into the SU. Basically what it's saying is they can't be employed at the district, they have to be employed by the SU. Transportation, the same thing. The reason why we're dragging our feet on this is that would create a whole nother bargaining unit as well, because now we'd have teachers as a bargaining unit in the SU as well as in each of the districts. And there's not really any efficiency there, it's just the law requires us to do it. We wouldn't become more efficient. It wouldn't help us in how we use staff, but it's the law and it's what we would have to deal with. We've been getting waivers, and if we were a red, we wouldn't have to worry about that because there would just be one employer. The SU assessment and shared service calculations that I do would go away. Right now, Essex Junction, all of the maintenance and IT staff that's being used by Essex Junction, those employees are actually employed by the high school district. And then EJ pays a shared service cost for that. The reason why we have it set up that way is so that, a custodian can be used in any one of the buildings, except for Westford. But between EJ and U46, those people can be deployed within either district. That's the good thing. The bad thing now, though, is that I have to allocate costs to be able to pay for that and do payments back and forth between the districts. None of that would be necessary. Cash flow is a big issue for us. One district is in a crunch one month, another one is in a crunch another month. So I'm always trying to make sure there's enough money in everybody's separate checkbooks. Well, there'd be one checkbook, and I would only have to worry about cash flow in one place instead of what I call hiding the P, trying to just make sure everybody's balanced. And of course, my pet peeve is just no more transferring funds between districts. I get Title I money that comes into the SU. There's an expense that happens in Essex Junction, so I see the expense, then I have to take that Title I money and send it to Essex Junction. That would all go away under a red.
In terms of the human resource side of the efficiencies, certainly we've already spoke about negotiations. You would have 2 teacher agreements and 2 support staff down to 1 each, so it just saves time. Right now, Essex Town is spending all the time and legal resources in order to negotiate their teacher contract, and CCSU is spending, hiring another attorney, spending the same amount of time to negotiate their agreements on both sides, so we'd have one agreement for each one. In terms of compliance, anytime there's a new law, new regulation, we're both struggling with how do you interpret that? The whole Affordable Care Act, it's been, a 5-year implementation, it's pretty much. And and we're all going to the same seminars, trying to learn all the different things. So we're duplicating that effort to figure out how is this going to impact us? How are we supposed to implement this? What is this next stage going to look like? So we're kind of doing the work twice whenever there's changes in laws and regulations that we need to deal with. Also, our mandatory training, development, and implementation. Each of us delivers and creates mandatory training for our employees. Policy update and development, we're both doing that work right now. Even though it looks differently, we're still doing that work, and it would just be the same going forward. Any communications around open enrollment for medical insurance, things of that sort would just be going out with one kind of unified message across, so you can put more effort into getting the message out. Website, also one website for, finance, HR, all of that, instead of having multiple websites for that. Substitute recruitment, we spoke about that already. Also, systems development. Essex Town uses ASOP. We also use ASOP. It took, 6 months to implement ASOP in Essex Town? It took about the same thing with us. It's not going to take a year combined. It would have been 6 months once versus 6 months twice. And the same thing happened with we have a professional development plan. They're using a different one, but it took a lot for each of us to do our own thing, and it wouldn't have taken that much time for us to just do it once and choose the right one for the whole system versus each working and trying to configure that current system. Also, the systems cost, I think, would go down as well for like ASOP and School Spring. Paying invoices, now we'll get invoices, for insurances or advertising. We get one invoice, at least in the CCSU, and we have to send them 4 different checks. So we have to figure out, well, what portion of that does Westford have to pay? What portion of that does Essex Junction have to pay? And then you send them 4 different checks, and then they call you up and say, how come you only sent me a partial payment? So there's all of those kind of nuances that goes on with that. Also, job description update and creation. We have similar positions. So right now we're both creating job descriptions for kind of the same positions. And when we're together, we would be doing it once.
And before we leave this slide, I know that one of the challenges that we've talked about is having to transition to common systems. And for example, we don't use the same finance system. We don't use the same student information system. So we might have to worry about transitioning. But before you put too much weight on that, there's the law now is telling us that we might need to go to a statewide system. So before you put too much stock in, that's going to be a lot of work, maybe we shouldn't do this, we're probably going to end up having to do it anyway, because there's probably going to be a statewide system that gets selected that we both may end up changing to. And instead of both doing it twice, we can just do it once. And the last slide, and it's and I hate even talking about this because Marla Durham isn't here today. But Essex Junction Recreation and Parks. Right now, we're assuming that a red board could take over management of EJRP, much like Essex Junction School District manages EJRP today. The one thing is, since the red wouldn't have the taxing authority, we're thinking that the village may, is George Tyler here? No, I can talk to him later. The village may end up actually having to take that budget article and add it to their warning because the red wouldn't have the taxing authority. So that's one thing we'd have to kind of sort out. The village would also continue to own the land, obviously. There wouldn't be an SU assessment, but if they still belong to the red, obviously they would need to be allocated some kind of cost for the support that we give so that we're not supplementing that. If EJRP then did end up departing at some point, I did hear that there was a question about how much would that cost. Well, I don't think it would cost the district anything. I think we'd just pull up the stakes. EJRP might need to start thinking about where they get some of the support from if it's not through Essex Junction School District. For example, their connection to the internet, or is that going to be impacted? Or are they going to have to do that a different way? But I don't think the red would see a significant cost if EJRP at some point in the future left. And the reason why I'm kind of making that scenario play out is I just think if this becomes an issue for a red vote, if it ultimately goes to a red vote, this could be divisive. If you start saying, well, we're going to take the EJRP out of the school districts, maybe the better way to do it is the municipalities are already talking about merging different functionalities. This is on the radar. So maybe if we just let the red manage EGRP in the near term, we could let that play out. And when it does play out, that's when the transition could occur. There may be some more in-depth discussion we might have to have on this, maybe some more legal counsel question on this, but I believe it could play out like this if you wanted it to. And that's it for our briefing. I'm not going to go into the backup slides with the exception of I was just going to show you on each of these enrollment projections down to where the dotted line is. Anything above the dotted line are actual enrollments, and obviously anything below the dotted line are projections. When we get a projection, it's not only for the next year, it's for the next several years. So these are in your backup slides, and this, as Roger said, bless you, as Roger said, even though we've had declining enrollment, these projections show that we're pretty stable. For instance, this is Westford. There's been significant decline, but going forward, it's actually projected that it's going to ramp back up a little bit in the future. That still means equalized pupils are going to go down in the near term for the next several years, but long term, we think we're in good shape. So that is it for our speaking presentation, and I'm glad to try to entertain questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grant, Roger, and Deb. Very in-depth, lots of information. But I'd love to open it up to the committee now for questions, so flag me down and I'll call on you for questions. Keely.
I have a couple of questions, and I'm sure other people need turns too, but just starting from back at the beginning of the presentation about governance, you're talking about reducing numbers of positions like clerk, moderator, and treasurer. Is that just an advantage in that it makes things simpler, or are these paid positions?
There's just no easy answer.
In Essex Town, I don't recall the numbers right offhand, but there are stipends associated with those positions,
Okay, so there would be a
$500,
cost
$700.
savings as
So,
well.
yeah, minimal savings dollar-wise, but probably more importantly, or equally important, I should say, is just that it would be the coordination and combination of same services rather than doing it separately.
Right, I think the duties are different right now depending on which district, so there might be a stipend associated with this because there's very little duties, and Essex Junction and U46, we have one person doing clerk and treasurer in both, and it's almost a full-time position. It's full-time in that it's over 30 hours a week, but it's not quite 40, and there are benefits associated, so that is a significant cost. So there could be a way to restructure that and really determine what are the needs, what do we really want the treasurer to do for the red, and maybe that could be a potential cost savings.
Thanks.
So the answer is mostly we're talking about stipend with the exception of the Essex Junction clerk / treasurer, which is an employee. And that's the employee that's about 30 to 34 hours a week.
Right.
So it's enough to have a full benefit package. So if this is restructured, maybe that position is a stipend like the others, and maybe that work is picked up by other staff members, or maybe not. We'd have to see. But at least you wouldn't have to try to figure out how to interact with 3 different treasurers. It would be one treasurer, and it would be the same kind of duties. You wouldn't have to try to think about turnover. Oh, now there's a different treasurer. Maybe that person's going to want to do things differently.
And in your point about voter engagement, if there were only one school board, like potentially if we have like 20 people in school boards right now, we would actually be able to have a choice of candidates. Which would certainly
I thought I was supposed to be the optimist here.
the one person.
Uncontested. Great. Who's next? Martha.
So I don't know if this is jumping the gun, but I remember when U46 was formed that there was a lot of transition work. It was very hard on the district. And I also remember when the previous unification study happened, the costs for transition, especially on the financial side, were estimated to be very high. Have you started looking at that cost?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the transition costs, how you would measure the transition costs. I think that also depends a lot on when you book the staffing savings. You know, if the first year there's still the same level of staffing in both superintendent's offices, then we could do a lot of that in-house. The grant that we're going to get, or you know, right now the two $150,000 grants minus the $25,000 for the study, that would fund a lot of trying to get on common systems. And I'm not sure what the complete body of work was that was being dealt with at that time. But you know, as an example, we have separate financial systems. If there isn't a statewide system selected, we would most likely pick one or the other and have to migrate to it. That would be a lot of work, but I see that as something we would be doing in-house to try to make it happen. I don't think we would be contracting it out and writing a check for it. Some of those transition costs, I think, the cost might be delaying the staffing reduction until you make it happen. But no, I don't have a specific dollar amount.
Actually, if I could add to that too, and reminding Grant how positive we want to be, I don't necessarily agree that it would be an inordinate amount of work. I know I think this is my 8th year with Essex Town, and it was shortly after I was hired that the last vote occurred. But at that time, we had a very antiquated accounting system and a separate payroll system. And yes, it was a busy summer getting the data combined into our more modern systems, a similar process to what CCSU went through a year or two earlier. But with both of us being on more recent platforms, I think that it would be a lot easier to merge and combine data than it was, say, for Essex Town 7 years ago to install the new system that we did.
Or bringing U46 into the CCSU.
Right. The other thing is if this committee takes it out and it's voted and it's approved, we're talking a July 1, 2017. Our teacher agreement right now expires in 2016. I believe Essex Town is looking for a 1-year agreement. If they both expire in 2016, it gives you a year to try to get closer to what you need it to be under the red. So you can start that negotiation process, maybe negotiate earlier as a one combined group for that final year to get closer to that, so that the next phase won't be as much. So you can do some of it in stages. We can be doing some of the research during that time if we have enough advance notice of what accounting system does make most sense for the red, and any of the other systems, you know, the different vendors, what are we going to do? So some of those things you can start those in advance and not have to, you know, July 1 all of a sudden you have to come up with everything.
And that's a good point too. Chittenden East, they were on a very quick timeline. They had their vote, and within 6 months, 8 months, they were a MUD, is I guess what they call it. But it was a lot easier for them because they weren't combining from anything external. They were just grouping. I mean, they didn't have to worry about different systems, so they were just collapsing, which is a lot easier than two separate entities joining together. But I agree with Deb, if we have not just 6 months, but a year and 6 months, that makes it more doable. It is a body of work. I think inordinate was one of those questions you told me I couldn't use. So, it is a body of work, but I think given that you have a year and a half, I think we could do it.
And not everything has to be done right away. You know, like all the job descriptions, it's not like you have to all of a sudden consolidate them all at once. You know, so you can phase things in. Yes, exactly. What's the most important thing? Let's focus on that first, get that underway, and then move on to the next thing. So you're not tackling everything all together.
And building the budget that first fall.
Right.
You know, that would be a bit of a challenge. You know, with getting everything structured so that you could build one budget. That would probably be the first kind of gate that we'd be looking at as far as trying to make sure we get that body of work done so that we can build that budget.
So one of my questions is about the sustainability of a combined system. So the incentives make it very appealing. you know, so it looks really nice, like, wow, 10, 8, whatever, you know, so, but what I'm worried about is after that 4th year, what if it jumps, you know, way back up? So we're stepping down in terms of the, you know, the incentives drop slowly, but does that mean in the 5th year, we're gonna spike right back up and get hammered with a high tax rate?
If I were to be pessimistic, I would tell you that after the first year, it's going to be a tax rate increase every year, because you know when you go from 8 cents to 6 cents, that's you know automatically after that 8-cent incentive, you're just going to be looking at a 2-cent increase every year. You know that's how it's going to be. It's the what have you done for me lately? You know mentality. But I think what you can do is. And I think this is a red board discussion too. I don't know that you would want to build a budget that has no flexibility in it and capitalizes on an 8-cent tax rate reduction. I think maybe what you do is in that first year, try to figure out if you can build a budget that reduces the tax rate by maybe 4 cents. And maybe you build a capital reserve fund so that makes it more sustainable, so that you have a large body of money, so that you're not having to bond for things like roof replacements. You know, you don't have large capital requirements that you're having to go out for because you've already got that bucket of money that you've created, and it also makes it more sustainable for a level tax rate. So I would be an advocate of trying to look in the budget process of how you can give some of this back in a savings and tax rate, but also how you can create a capital reserve for specific, I mean, not a slush fund, but a capital reserve for valid future capital requirements, so that then it does become more sustainable with a more level tax rate.
And I also do think there will be some staffing savings. You know, after the transition phase, I think there will be a level of fewer staff that you're going to need kind of at the central office level as a result of that. So whether it takes 2 or 3 years to complete the transition, I think at that point, I think before the incentives completely go away, you're going to be able to see that reduction in the staffing needs that are needed.
And some possible efficiencies, as we alluded earlier, staffing in general.
Right.
So.
Martha, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah. Have you been thinking at all about the fact that if a number of districts across the state do REDs and do get them approved and do get these reductions in tax rates, what's that going to cost the state, and how much is that going to increase the tax rate?
I was thinking about that.
And you know, it just makes me feel like we're going to have to be really, really careful about what we say to the public, because we could lose trust right off the bat. Because if 20 districts get these incentives, I haven't done the math, but that's going to cost the education fund a lot of money. The legislature, the state, isn't putting new dollars into the education fund to pay for this. I think they're hoping that the efficiencies will lead to lower requirements, but we don't know that.
Let's make sure we're the first one.
Well, exactly. I think if anything, that makes it even more critical to see if we can get this to the voters and get it approved, because if we don't form a RED and we're not one of the ones at the trough to get this tax incentive, then we've got an even bigger problem.
Right.
But I do think that part of the communication is managing the expectations. And like I said, right off the bat, I wouldn't be trying to just do a no flexibility in a budget, just, no meat on the bones at all, and reduce the tax rate 8 cents, because I just think it would be irresponsible and you would have a huge tax increase within the next few years. So right off the bat, I'm saying I don't think you should be trying to tell people that they're going to see an 8-cent reduction. I think it makes it very reasonable to think that you could probably manage budgets for a few years without any kind of tax rate increase and without having to cut programs, which is what we could be facing. But I don't think we're really going to know until you start building each of those budgets and you see what the base rate ends up being passed to you. Because that's what you're talking about, is because of this and the bills that are gonna be created, instead of a 99 cent or a $1 base rate, maybe you see a $1.10 base rate. So, yeah, I've thought about it, but I haven't solved it.
So Mitchell had his hand raised for the next question.
So you have all these efficiencies you're building in. We're going to have less boards, less people at the supervisory union. And my concern is, instead of now taking that efficiency and equating it to dollars saved, oh, let's do this a little differently. Let's be a little fancy here. Let's be a little fancy here. Let's spend more money. Can you speak to what that would look like? Because I'd rather see more efficient and have that passed on to the municipalities here, instead of it, spending more money on administration, which is not a direct cost, it's an indirect.
Yeah, and I think, well, the short answer is, I think if this occurs, then you're gonna have a red school board that's gonna make those decisions and give us the direction on what it's gonna look like for a staffing. I don't think that we're looking at, well, let's just add a bunch of things to make it prettier. What we are talking about is there might be some positions that it might make sense. Like, if we bring in busing for Essex Junction, that's a body of work. I mean, so we might have to change things around. It may not be adding. I mean, we may realign duties. Maybe it is still seeing a savings. I agree with Deb that, I can't tell you how many positions will be reduced, but I feel pretty comfortable, unless the red school board that would be created gives me some really different guidance. I feel pretty comfortable in saying there will be staffing savings. I mean, Roger and I know, we've already flipped the coin how many times? We know that there aren't going to be two of us. It's just, there's no way. But there might be a transportation coordinator where there wasn't one before. But I think that we would definitely be looking to try to make sure that there were savings, not any kind of level. I mean, we wouldn't be looking to build a superintendent's office that has the exact same number of people that the two have. But we would be taking direction from a red board. And so I think it becomes a red board question.
I'll go back to Keely.
If you are talking about taking some of that 8 cent incentive from the state on the taxes, and instead of passing on the full 8 cents in the tax bill, spending 4 of the cents on a capital fund, for instance, is that something that would then push our budget into like the penalty zone? Or because it wouldn't be part of the school district budget, it would be okay to direct that money that way?
I think if you look at this slide, well, actually it's FY16. So whenever I talked about excess spending threshold,
Right.
U46, that number right there, 16,098, that's about $1,000 away from the threshold. But combined as a red, we'd be at 15,000. So we have a lot more space.
But budgeting
And-
something from that 8 cent incentive, would that be included in that calculation?
It would end up being, it's not included in that number, but it would be included. So you're right, it would be something we would have to make sure that we don't put $6 million back in. But I think that if you did put money into a capital reserve, you could put quite a bit in there and you wouldn't be, well, either one of us, if we're building that budget in FY18, neither one of us would allow that number to hit the excess spending threshold. I mean, we know that we wouldn't be around the next year if we did.
I'm looking at this side of the table. Questions?
I'll just echo the concern, because it was my number one question that Martha raised, that the impact of the tax incentives then affect the ed fund, then affect our tax. We saw this, not this budget, but the previous budget, where our increases were at 2 and our tax increases were at 10 or 12% increase. And that was a real challenge. I know Brendan remembers it well, and having our community understand the pieces of it that we were really impacting, despite the fact their checkbook and their home costs were as they were. So that was my single biggest concern as we went through this, and I think it's probably bigger than just getting out ahead of it and making sure we get it. I think it's legitimate to consider, and the sustainability that Brendan presented is a big concern as I think about budgets going forward, and cliffs and immediate increases that happen after the incentives. So
Brian?
I get a little confused that I think the last time I knew about 65% of our communities are not paying purely on their property. So how does the 8 cents work with income sensitivity? I mean, I think we're all inside baseball and we're talking 8, 6, 4, 2, 10, 10, 8. But to be able to see that happen on anybody's tax rate, I think it could be a little hard. Do I have that right? So if you're on income sensitivity, do you see 8 cents someplace?
No, because in addition to blended tax rates between Essex Junction and U46 and Essex County U46, you have blended tax rates, meaning income sensitized homestead. I don't know how to model that because the income sensitivity depends on the household income. So it's going to be different for everybody. So it's kind of the cheater's way out, looking at just property tax without looking at its income sensitivity. I think it's something you have to own up to and say, this is just if you were paying education tax based on property. But I really don't know how to model it with factoring in income sensitivity.
I could just add to that too. I don't know how to model that either, but we've done calculations the last number of years in Essex town. I think one simple response is if there's savings, if you're paying based just on property, that there will most likely be some savings if you're paying based on income sensitivity too. I've calculated that the we use a few different levels of income and property value, and the percentage change in the amount that those residents are paying on their bills aren't exactly the same as the percentage change if you're basing it just on property, and they're not always uniform, but there is some resemblance between the two. So.
If you have other people. Well, for Essex Town and Essex Junction, do you do a blended income sensitivity rate?
Yes.
So you should be able to show that. But in fact, that 8 cents isn't going to have any effect on people who pay solely based on income. Now, in Westford, there are hardly any people who pay solely based on income because our zoning is such that almost everyone has more than 2 acres of land. I would assume that in Essex Junction there probably are more people who do pay just on income. And Essex Town's probably a little more like Westford. In general.
And that you can model what the income sensitivity rate would be. It's just that it's hard when you're trying to model how like somebody's tax bill will be impacted, because even if 2 people are both income sensitized, it's at a different level depending on what their household income
and
is.
it changes from year to year.
Yeah, and income sensitivity, that rate has changed dramatically, as most of you know. It went from 1.8% to 1.94%, which was a dramatic increase this past year. And I would have to go back into the law to see what it says the incentive looks like on income sensitivity. I don't know if there was something in there that talked about, a commensurate level. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Yes, go ahead.
When you were talking about differences, one of the thoughts that came to my mind, and I know we've got the, well, I'm wondering if there's a difference, any significant differences in debt level between the various districts, and how that could end up being an issue with the public. In other words, are certain districts at a much higher debt level and some at a much lower debt level, where they might say, look, we would have paid this off in 5 years?
There's a link on, I think it's on tonight's, the tonight's section, your agenda or whatever. There's a link there that talks about long-term debt. Westford just finished paying their last long-term debt. Essex Junction will finish paying their long-term debt this coming year, I believe. The rec department still has a debt, long-term debt for the pool and building renovations that's good until 2019 at about $100,000 a year. U46 has significant debt because of the One Campus project and the library project. And Essex Town, well, their information is on there. I guess the caveat I would make, though, to that is there's also some state construction aid that goes toward offsetting that. But kind of back to my original statement about the tax rates, those long-term debt payments are part of the expense that's factored into the tax rate. So while there are differences in levels of debt, that's all factored into what tax rates are. So from my perspective, I don't think it's that different. I know, especially between Essex Junction and Essex Town, it's not that big of a deal because most of the debt is in U46, which both of those communities are paying anyway. Do you have any other thoughts?
Right, yeah. Essex Town has just two specific debts. One, and I don't know exactly how it works as a revenue to the high school budget, but is the buy-in fee that Essex Town was charged when we joined U46. That debt is paid off in 2016, and then we have a renovation in addition to our middle school, which is paid off in 2020. So.
But that's, you can look it online.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess, looking at the 10% or 8%, 6%, whatever the pattern is going to be of savings, I think that's something that's good, and if we can take advantage of that, great. But I think as a committee, we really need to convince ourselves, and then ultimately the citizens, that the structure that results is more efficient and cost effective than the existing structure. And I think if you can't come to that conclusion, then the percentages, while they're good in the first few years, I think just raise a question. Now, in your presentation, I think you offer up a huge number of areas of potential cost savings. And although I know you don't want to put numbers on them, I've got to believe that going from filling out 5 sets of income taxes down to 1, it's got to save thousands of dollars. I mean, it has to, right? And on and on and on, all the administrative costs. So there has to be quite a bit of savings there. So my thought is, the fear that what if 20 groups in the state go to this, will that affect the overall state rate? Yeah, it might, but it'll be driving the state where we want it, which is to a more efficient structure. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the communication we really got to be able to get out and convince ourselves and the rest of the people if that's the route we want to go.
I think whenever you're talking, CCSU and Essex Town, the efficiency I see there is, going from 2 to 1.
Yeah.
But what I'm really focused on is CCSU because that's where I live.
Sure.
And I can tell you that, I'm a retired military person, and when I came to the CCSU, I thought, wow, what an inefficient structure. Coming from a retired military person, that's not a good thing. And so if that was my so I definitely think there are efficiencies to be gained within CCSU alone, and then not as dramatic, but instead of going from 4 to 1, 2 to 1. So yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of efficiencies there. And the only thing I don't want to do as far as putting a number on it is there's a lot of the questions like we were discussing. The red board would be kind of leading some of this, so I don't know what to assume for a superintendent's office. You know, but I do know that there are savings that we've talked about. You know, there's not going to be two of us. There's going to be one of us. There's probably not going to be X number of payroll and accounting technicians. There's probably going to be X minus one or something like that. So I do think that whatever the costs that we might see will definitely be offset by savings. But I do share the concern that the way you see those savings and what you do to manage it locally can then build, and then as a state level, there could be some unintended consequences there. But I definitely I'm sold on this is the right thing to do for the community.
And certainly, I think you'd also would not want to lose sight of some of the other advantages that we've spoken about in terms of student learning and outcomes.
Oh, absolutely.
Some of the as CCSU talks about needing to file a certain report 4 times and pay a bill 4 times or whatever. Some of that is foreign to Essex Town because we do those things once.
Mm-hmm.
I could probably say or estimate how long it takes us to do each of those functions. I know from experience, because I've worked in a couple of school districts that are far larger, about three or 4 times larger than our combined district would be, that if we were all merged, it would not take the merged district any longer to do most of this work than it takes singular Essex Town. So yeah, there would be savings.
I have a question about there was a comment, Grant, you talked a little bit about it, there was a Westford potential spike on the hold harmless thing. I don't understand a thing about that, so could you explain that?
I'm sure the
Thank
person
you.
to your left would be.
I could ask Martha,
So, equalized pupils, if the way the law has always been, if you have a decrease of more than 3.5% in your equalized pupil count, it gets cut at 3.5%. So you don't have to deal with more than a 3.5% reduction, which is a big deal because your spending is divided by your pupil count to come up with your spending per pupil, which is a big factor in your tax rate calculation. Westford has been held harmless at that 3.5% for several years. Part of H361 is to do away with hold harmless protection, but not to do away with
Phase
it.
it out.
They're going to phase it out, but their phase out is making it 10% instead of 3.5%. Well, 10% basically eliminates it for Westford. So they lose that equalized pupil count. It's looking like it might be for next year, although I testified trying to make it FY18 to allow people to have some time to react to that.
Right.
So it won't help for FY17, but because it's been held harmless for so long, they would see that protection for several years. So even though it won't help them for FY17, I think it will probably still help them in FY18 because as a merged entity, they wouldn't need that protection. There would be a larger group, and in total, we may only see a reduction of like 1% in equalized pupils. So they wouldn't need that protection anyhow in a larger district.
Keely?
I wanted to second Gary's point, responding to Kim and Martha's concern about red incentives like bankrupting the state education fund. Probably the state is doing this because they see unsustainable spending if we go on our current trajectories. They're willing to spend up front in order not to have to spend later. So we're going to see those increases at some point, whether it's because of an upfront payment or over time just things getting more and more expensive. If we think it's a bad idea and it's going to bankrupt the state, that's not something that we can fix in a red. I mean, our two options are like talk to our state representatives or go around to everybody else who forms a red committee and say, none of us should take the money. Which I don't think is going to work. So our duty as a red committee is to try to do what seems best the way the law stands with what the state has given us. And what the state has given us, there's these incentives, so we should try to get them. If we think the incentives are a bad idea, we should talk to our state representatives. And if somebody asked me about it, that's kind of what I would say.
So I would just say, I certainly think we should take the incentives. I just want us to be cautious about what we promise the taxpayers because of the potential effect at the state level.
And I think I would just respond that I think, at least where I was coming from, was very in line with Gary's thinking, that it has to be about more than just the incentive, because we've weathered in very recent past the effects of the statewide costs on driving our local taxes, despite what we could do for our budgets. So it's a real consideration. It doesn't mean we don't take the money or we're not interested in the incentive. We can't make a decision based on 4 or 5 years worth of incentives. That goes to, I think, Brendan's comment regarding sustainability. I think this decision has to be based on all the information and can't be bought by the incentives.
I mean, I feel like the incentive is there to cushion us from the initial outlay of the transition costs. Not to like put us in some paradise of low taxes.
And we'll see really quickly the second year that it wouldn't do that. So, so I think we're all probably saying the same thing, and I think probably the most important thing to me is Gary's comment that it's really a sustainability issue, and we're all sort of talking around it, but the incentives will be helpful and they shouldn't be the reason we do it.
Brian?
It may be really simple, or if it's too confusing, we can forget about it. But so it's it's $1.44 in that calculated tax rate that you did for the communities. Is that assessed? Like, how does that then go down to the next level? Like, to the Westford residents and EJ, is it on ADM? Is it on tax base? Is it capital grand list?
No, it's a great question. Actually, everybody would have what's called an equalized tax rate, homestead tax rate of $1.44. The only difference by community is the CLA. So if your CLA is different, then your actual homestead tax rate would be different. But the only difference in tax rate would be based on an individual community's common level of appraisal.
Yeah. Which I think that feeds off of, it's just one more pretty major kink in the armor, talking about 8 cents, 6 cents, 4 cents, 2 cents, is that it's never going to be that. There's going to be income sensitivity, there's going to be CLA, there's going to be increases to the state ed tax rate. It's just going to be so difficult to ever prove that to the voters, to say this is what you'll get, here's what you got. Is that, I mean, right away you could have, it could be a 9 cent savings in EJ because of the CLA, and it could be a 2 cent savings because of the CLA in Westford, just in at any given time. So I just kind of put that out. The fungibility of that savings is real. It's real dollars, but it's going to be really hard to trace back and prove that you delivered on it.
Yeah, I think the challenge there, Brian, is that so many people, I think the conversation will be like, okay, this is all well and good, but how does it affect me?
Yeah.
And
Where's
so
my
being
8
able
cents?
to, draw that illustration out for an individual will be really dicey.
Well, I think that's why you go back on,
Yeah.
does the budget, are we able to spend the same or some reasonable amount more or less to educate our kids and get the outcome because we have the efficiencies and the cost effectiveness? And can we maintain that budget for a longer period of time had we than if we had not merged? That's going to be the big question. That's the, are we better off for it financially? Not for, are we better off with the incentives? The answer is sure, absolutely. Any incentive will be good. It will just be hard to trace to the individual. Having a solid educational system for our kids will be the outcome that everyone can kind of. Right.
And I think that even if, well, I can't speak for the other two folks, but I think even if there wasn't an incentive other than just the $150,000 times 2, I think I would still be for this, because I think it makes a more efficient structure. It makes a more efficient organization. I think it makes us more able to focus on student needs and less on adult needs and reporting needs. So I would still be standing here saying I'm for this, even if it wasn't for the 8-6, 4-2, 10-10, 8-6-4, whatever.
I agree in part too that, but again, I would come back to the educational advantages for students coming through a system that's integrated and all schools preparing students in the same fashion for the next level. I do think an important reality in all this though too, along with some efficiencies and that better preparation for students, are these incentives, these financial incentives that when Grant gave us the totals of $4 million or whatever, that's real money and that's big money, and yeah, we'd have to be judicious in how we explain that to the public, but those are significant financial opportunities. So
I have a comment that may lead to a question. You know, what's different, there's a, you know, obviously we all know there's a big statewide debate going on about this question, but I think Essex Town and CCSU, we don't really fit into the narrative that is developing in most parts of the state. We're not talking about schoolhouses with, you know, 40 kids and declining enrollments of 20% over 3 years or whatever. So, but, you know, the biggest expense in a human organization like a school district is staff and salaries and benefits. But in the projections that I just briefly looked at, I didn't get a chance to fully dive into them. It looks like enrollment is predicted to be pretty level. And so one of the questions that, or one of the, I guess, narratives that's developing is that Vermont is losing students, but we're keeping the same number of teachers and administrators. And, you know, that needs to be fixed. And so there's this narrative developing about that staffing is the problem. And not just central staff. We have too many teachers and we have too few kids. But what I'm seeing, in at least the data that we're presenting here, is that we're not seeing that there might be a huge savings in a reduction in teachers. That it would mostly be savings from merging shared duties across the two districts in central office capacities and other support staffing.
It can give you, you're correct, I don't think we are looking at a lot of teacher reductions or support staff reductions, but it can give you some opportunities. You know, we might look at different models for our nursing structure. If we could share a full-time nurse, you know, if there's a full-time nurse that could, and we can hire a full-time nurse to work between two schools and a full-time maybe LPN, that could also, that, you know, that gives us more opportunity because there's more schools to share. Westford is kind of their own house and their own school and their own district. It makes it a little bit more difficult. I mean, there might be little bits of savings. I don't see any significant savings, but there gives us more opportunity to allocate the resources a little bit differently.
But I think you're right. I think this is an exciting opportunity for us. It would make us more efficient and effective. But I think there are others out there in the state that would save dramatically more money than us, because they would be talking about closing schools, you know, making huge staffing reductions in you know, teacher staff because of class size standards. Class size standards is another thing that's not our problem. You know, our class sizes are good. I mean, we have healthy class sizes. So I do think that there are a lot of other organizations, educational organizations in the state, that would benefit even more dramatically than we would. But I hope they do it. I hope I hope this goes through and we can be a beacon for others to follow. I think whenever those other organizations start doing this, that's where you see the statewide savings.
which will help offset the incentives on the table.
Brian.
I'm curious, Deb, in the next 5 years or so, it looks like conservatively might be looking at about 30% turnover of our current teaching staff to retirement, just where they are. What does a merged district provide potentially for that type of recruitment, training, mentoring, placement that a non-merged district might? Because that's a big wholesale change
Right.
that we haven't experienced before, any of our districts.
You do have a little bit more flexibility, of course, on your mentoring assignments, but also on your assignments of your teachers. You can switch teachers from building to building should you so choose. If you're having 10 classroom teachers that in one elementary school leaving in 1 year, you might want to put more experienced teachers in that school so you can kind of reallocate your staff a little bit more. And you can also have more mentoring ability across districts. If we hire a school nurse in Westford, it's hard to find a mentor. They're working for Essex Junction, but now who's paying for that cost because they're an employee of Essex Junction and not of Westford. So there's certain things that limit it or make it a little bit more complex when you're within an SU structure versus a red. I don't think having a red is going to make it any more difficult than it would be, because we're still, whether we have 30% turning over staying as an SU or you have 30% turnover being a red, it's going to be the same impact. But I think it would lessen some of that impact just having more resources to pull from. You might have some economies where you have literacy specialists that work across schools that can help transition new staff members as well, or math specialists that work throughout those schools. That can help, but I don't think it's going to make it worse than what it would be individually.
Yeah, Wes.
Brendan, you mentioned fewer teachers, and what's the percent of cost for teach? 70% of the budget for instruction?
Yeah, it varies from district to district, but I think statewide it's a lot less in Westford, for example, because Westford tuitions high school students, so there's this different. But I'd say statewide, maybe 75% of districts' expenses are salaries and benefits.
I just think we have to be careful that the public doesn't see it as we're merge and save money because we got rid of teachers, because that defeats the whole purpose of quality education. I think maybe down the road might have to do that, but I wouldn't want that to start off with. To me, that would be disastrous.
Well, and it doesn't look, at least my cursory review of the numbers, it doesn't look like there would be a lot of flexibility in doing that anyway, based on the enrollment projections and the current teaching staff.
Well, the reason I'm saying that is, the general public, that's where they always want to go for us.
Right.
Get fewer teachers, fewer administrators, we can save money, we don't need all these people, kind of thing.
But while there's not the opportunity presently, the merged district would have greater flexibility in future years.
Right. Kim?
A different question, but to that point, Wes, I know all of our class sizes are, pushing our maximum under our policies, and we all have class size policy. It's a required policy by the state, so I don't think we find ourselves in the same position that the statewide conversation is, because we really can't afford to cut back teachers given our current class sizes. So I don't think that's really at risk. I'm gonna, at the risk of sort of sounding town-centric, just because I know our administration well, we're pretty skeletal, Roger, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know the efficiency of our very tight operation with our small crew of folks in our central office. And so from the town's perspective, and I absolutely hear you guys talking about the greater efficiencies to happen, bringing you guys to all of us into one umbrella and cutting 4 or 5 duplications of all of the things that are happening in the SU. And I would love to maybe think about what could we do more of, maybe, Roger, because I'm not sure that there's more money to be eked out of our central office with people doing a few jobs and wearing, their one set of shoes, doing lots of hats. So what are some of the things that we'd love to do that we just maybe are limited? And that if this is not something you're prepared to answer, that's fine, but that's one of the questions I have from the town standpoint, because I know we're tight.
So
we
if
do
I'm
like
following correctly, what
like
what
86%,
additional services?
yeah. Well, what are some of the things that we wish we could do that we just can't do with the staff that we have? Because I know that 86% of our budget is paying human resources that are directly touching kids, so teachers, paras. So we've got 14% of our budget that's on everything else, custodial staff, central office, principals, So I think aside from teachers and paras, which is a big part of our budget, I think we're pretty tight. And I know there's not the same kind of duplication that you guys have to deal with. But I'm also wondering, what else could we do more? And I know, even from the kids' standpoint, we want to know the journey of the kid is all the way through 12 and beyond. So that's an incentive of ours. But I just didn't know if, would we be able to do more with communication? And again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. It could be something you can come back to us with those ideas.
I'd probably ask for some time to come back with further ideas. I think the quick answer is we do everything quite well already.
No, I know that. We're not doubting that at all.
But more seriously, you mentioned central office staff. I think our communications and the services our limited central office staff offer other district employees are good. Certainly, those CCSU has a much larger maintenance staff than we do. So there would be advantages of being able to access some of that assistance and share talents. So that's one thing that comes to me quickly.
Thanks, Judge.
Mark,
It took a long time to get there, Brendan.
that's all right. Mark, you had your hand up. I don't.
Just to read, I think there's a handout, there's something on the website that I think the metric that the state is using more so than the student and staff teacher ratio is the student to adult ratio. And I think last time I looked at the state level, it's somewhere in 1 to 4.8, 1 to 4.9 at the state level. And we're in the high 5s and 6 levels. So we're already have a higher ratio student to adult. Adults is everybody who's employed versus kids to the classroom teacher. So I would agree with our class sizes are high, but we also are above the average in terms of adults as well.
And I should
Which is a good thing.
I should jump ahead of the question too. Whenever we have those data sheets and we put it on one data sheet, and you'll be able to see the columns for each district, the first thing that you might notice is that Essex Town's ratio for adult to student is lower than the CCSU districts. Well, before you jump to any conclusions there, the reason why is as a single district, all central office staff is also included there. And in our 3 separate school districts, none of those individual ones includes the superintendent's office. So ours doesn't include that. So we'll put a caveat on that. So I just wanted to make sure that that didn't cross you up at all. Essex Town's number might initially look different, but we'll put an asterisk on there because it does include the superintendent's office, while our districts did not or do not.
Other questions or observations?
The one observation I have is it makes me think when we're talking about trying to educate the public about all of this, and here we're spending weeks and hours and hours and hours and hours. It seems like we should be trying to and we've talked about this before, let the public know what we're doing on a measured basis, because I keep thinking of those fast-talking guys at the end of the car commercials, we're gonna have to do a half hour of that, everybody, and say, did you understand that? So it just seems that so they don't have to try to swallow a whole bunch at one time, which they wouldn't. We've got to do more, I think, now, so that they know what we're doing and can develop some trust in the fact that we're doing our homework.
Well, at our next meeting, and I know it's been delayed, but at our next meeting, we're going to have that exact conversation about how do we begin to shift as a committee to thinking about what we need to know in order to make an informed decision and an informed recommendation, and what does the community need to know, what kinds of conversations do we want to have with the community. I think you're absolutely right. It's important. It's not going to be a simple conversation. We can't squeeze it into the end of the commercial, but I think it's an important enough conversation that we have to figure out how to have it right. So I want to make sure that at our next meeting we're going to spend a good hour plus talking about how do we begin to do that. and I Brian and I met a couple of weeks ago to look at sort of the extended timeline of our work together, and not at the next meeting, but possibly the meeting after that, I think we'll begin to take some straw poll, to see how people are feeling about a recommendation, to just get a sense of the committee in terms of where people are leaning. What are the questions that still are outstanding that need to be answered in order to make an informed decision? So I just want to make sure that, we continue to do the work that we need to do as a committee to make the right recommendation, while also beginning to think ahead about what kinds of communication and engagement do we need to have with the community. So it's a great point, though. Other comments? Yes.
Just
Kim.
have one question to that, Brendan. Will we be asked for that sort of straw poll before hearing like a survey feedback from the community on what they need to know? Because I'm not positive that I feel in a position to know that we've responded to what questions might be out there, because we haven't asked that.
So let me make sure I understand. So are you thinking that
Like if we need to tell you next week where we stand, we haven't heard back from our communities around what questions they have to feel as though they can trust that we've done our homework, to that point.
Yeah, no, I think that obviously I want to call that question at the right time. I think that I would, to the point that Brian made, I think at the beginning of our work together, is that hopefully we're becoming the experts in the community on this topic, and so I think it is going to be important to get a sense of where the committee's leaning, even as we're engaging the community and finding out what other questions they may have. So I'm not looking to sidestep that process, but I also want to make sure that the committee, as a working body, has an opportunity to weigh in, and to just get a sense of where we are, and also what questions are outstanding, so that we can pursue the answers to those questions. But I'm not thinking it would in any way sidestep an engagement with the community. I don't think that would be a smart move. Other questions?
I just have one clarification, because it's been picking up my brain. And I'm just looking at H361, and in the incentive sections, it does say the household income percentage shall be calculated accordingly. I have no idea. But
You don't know, the rest of us do.
but perhaps it does mean that there will be some adjustment to the income-sensitive numbers. So I'll make some inquiries of my friends at Joint Fiscal.
What, was there also something about a limit to tax increases that would?
Yeah, it says something about 5%. I don't know what that means either.
I think that's if the tax rate is going to reduce, say, 6 cents in the first year, if 6 cents is more than a 5% reduction, then you may not be able to get that full 6 cents. I don't think it would impact us, because the tax rates are about $1.50. So 5% would be what, 7.5 cents.
Nice.
So I don't think that the final tax rate would be more than a 5% difference. So I did see that too, but I don't think it will play out for us. I don't think it's a limiting factor for us.
And that's the House version. I didn't look at the Senate version to see if they have retained.
I think it was still in the Senate version, but I'm not 100%.
Complicated.
Excellent.
Just two comments. One, I appreciate the conversation about how do you get the information conveyed to the community, because it's certainly a wealth of information, and the reality is that people are not going to understand this as well as you do, and you may not think that you really understand it all, and it's going to be difficult to translate. But I would encourage you to take an evening like tonight, which I think is very substantive in terms of information provided, and identify those things that kind of tweak you, that are pieces of information that would be important for your community members to know and understand. So that's one point. And I kind of feel like I'm the self-appointed person to be paying attention to acronyms, and you've really done very well with limited acronyms tonight. But I wondered if it would be beneficial for the committee to understand what the phraseology of equalized per pupil means, of equalized pupil. people understand that language? Could Roger, could you just do a thumbnail on, because it has to do with the weights of how kids are counted in the state. That's important to the formula, but I do think that if you had some idea that it's the language that sometimes can distract people because they consider it to be educational jargon, but it's a way that we define children when we count them for financial purposes.
I'll take a shot at it. That chart that I had the tax rates calculated, so it starts with your total expenses. Then you subtract out revenues, meaning anything that's not general state support grant.
Yeah.
You know, anything other than what the
All
taxes
revenue except the education fund.
Right. And then that gives you what's called education spending. You divide your education spending by your equalized pupils, and equalized pupils are it's the average of the prior 2 years' average daily membership. And average daily membership means, as of maybe it's October 1, there's a snapshot of how many kids are in the school. Not how many kids are in the school right then, but how many kids are enrolled at that school. And it's counted over a 40-day period. So, for example, if somebody has been in your school for 40 days, then they're 1. If a kid has come in on day 21 and has only been there for 20 days, then that kid would only be counted as a 0.5. So they look at your average daily membership over that period of time for 1 year and then for the previous year and average that together. And say that averages to be 100 kids. That number then gets tweaked by factors like, are these kids high school kids? If so, then we'll add like 13% of a weight to make those kids count for more.
So a high school student doesn't count as one pupil, he or she counts as 1.13.
A preschool kid only goes to school for 10 hours a week. That child is only counted as a 0.46. An English language learner student, I think, is another 20%. So that child would count as a 1.2. What's another one? Poverty. Free and reduced lunch child might count as a 1.2. So those things are all averaged together, and they come up with a number that's an equalized pupil number. And I'm sorry, but there's still another step. And that step is whenever they come up with that number across the state, that number might be 90,000 kids. Well, the actual number of students in Vermont might only be 87,000. So you can't have 3,000 kids that don't exist. So they figure out what that number is, and they say, okay, now multiply your number of 90,000, multiply it by 0.96, so that you get back down to the number of real kids. So after all of that calculation is done, you end up with an equalized pupil count for your district. And then, so you have education spending divided by your equalized pupil count, and that's your education spending per equalized pupil. And that becomes a key factor in what your local tax rate is. And I'm sorry I can't explain that any better, but
That was
good.
You forgot hold harmless, but.
Oh yeah, that's right. The hold harmless creates those kids that don't exist again.
You can do my taxes.
You may not want to go to this level of detail. That was, I really understood that. And it leads me to the question of what is a phantom child?
That is what Mark was just talking about. If you had a reduction of 5% in your equalized pupil count, then you are leveled off at just 3.5%. So there might be 9 kids that don't really exist that you get credit for in your equalized pupil count.
And they're called phantom.
And those are the phantom students that you get.
Well, your weightings will create phantom students too, right? I mean, if you have a body, but you're counting it as 1.2, that's a 0.2 phantom student you've just created.
That's right.
But then that's where they end up multiplying by a 0.97.
Yeah, exactly. That's a phantom student as well.
But in part, the reason for some of the weightings is because it's more expensive.
Oh,
to
absolutely, yeah, I
educate
understand
a
the
high school
concept,
student
yeah.
than a younger student or a English language learner.
Right.
See what you did, Brian?
I'm good, I wanted to make sure that you left completely confused. But the point is that there are weights attached to acknowledge some equity, that it may be a bigger investment if you have a high poverty population, or you have a high ELL population, and that the formula tries to take into account additional funds for that, but then equates it across the state.
And that, actually, it is kind of getting a little off topic, but whenever you talk about communities that have high poverty levels and high ELL populations, and you hear like a statewide initiative to try to funnel more money into that community, something to think about, and I'm not trying to be negative here, but that community is already getting an artificially high equalized pupil count, which means their tax rate is going to be lower for that community. Because of a high FRL, free and reduced lunch population, they qualify for more federal funding, so they have more local revenues, which means their education spending is going to be lower. So there's already a lot of benefits that are built into the system for those communities in need. And you know, we don't have a whole lot of those adjustments. I mean, our free and reduced population is higher than it's probably ever been, but it's still not nearly as high as others.
Any other questions or translations of acronyms or calculations that you want done on the fly?
There's lots of calculations I want done, but not on the fly.
Well, I want to thank our three guests tonight. You did a great job. Really appreciate your
We would like to thank all of you for your service. I know this is long nights, and
Exactly.
I know you don't get paid a whole lot.
Yeah,
Yeah, where's that $25,000?
cookies.
Where's the cookies?
No, you misplaced the decimal, the stipend is
Yeah.
25%.
So you can stay or you can go. We're going to just continue to plow through here because I think we might have an opportunity to end a little early tonight. Brian, I think you wanted to at least touch upon the statewide conversation as it sits. We brought it up earlier, but
Yeah, I was just gonna, Grant actually probably summarized what's worth sharing tonight in terms of the H361, that there is a Senate version. I don't think, at least in the research that I've done on it, that there's a whole bunch of discussion that needs to take place on that bill at this point in time. I think we need to let it run its course through the Senate, and I would expect that within the next couple of weeks we'll have more detail about that. I will send to Ben tomorrow a comparison between the House bill and the Senate bill as they stand, so you can see what seems to be the simplest breakdown of comparing one bill with the other and the incentives. But there's still work to be done. There still seems to be a lot of different opinions between the House and the Senate, and questions as to whether or not this will still be something that will be alive and well at the end of the session or not.
Brian, my one question is there anything being debated right now in the legislature that would directly impact the work of this committee? In other words, would we stop? Would we restart? Would it change?
What I got from, I spoke with Jeff Francis a bit yesterday to kind of get a sense of that. I'm sorry for people I'm speaking to your backs. But, you know, Jeff's sense was that what I took away from that conversation was that he did not anticipate that any school systems or communities that were pursuing or had pursued or had been successful in their pursuit, like a Chittenden East, was going to be adversely impacted by whatever the legislation was. That there seemed to be a constant or a theme that if you were already out of the gate, you would in no way be penalized by not being able to benefit by the same intent that the legislature seems to be discussing for people to go further down this road. And I think that the language somebody was talking about was the accelerated effort. And that if you were to meet the guidelines or the criteria around the accelerated effort, that you might be eligible for a greater incentive. But from what I got was no, but I think that there's always that qualifier, but you just don't know until it's over. So.
There's not any scenario, is there, where like Colchester could decide, oh, we want to join a red and we want to join your red Like, can we join your red?
I think any of those things are possibilities, but I don't know if that would be the outcome of this. And my sense is that the state is not trying to foist this upon any community you've got to do it because somebody else wants to. I think that they're still focusing on the voluntary aspect of it with greater incentives, but also some stronger belief statements that this is the way for us to be headed long-term for the sustainability of our schools as well as the quality of the education we're trying to afford kids. Mitchell.
Well, Nat brought up a good point. If we form the red, everything goes together, and then culture says, hey, we want in. How do we answer that? Nope. We're full, or is there a process that we can do that?
That may be a conversation about, okay, so what's the incentive for us to take our Colchester? And from what was already presented as, from a scaling standpoint, we're good to go with what we've got here if this is what you design. And I think that other relationships will have to be developed and evolve around that, and state support would need to be provided to help people to look at some other alternatives. And I like to believe that there's a common sense factor that comes into play. I'm also referred to as being naive sometimes, thinking that will play the rule of thumb.
I would also say that there's some research that the Secretary Holcomb has mentioned that kind of the sweet spot for a district as far as size goes is about 2,000 to 4,000, and we would be near the high end on that. So I think that would certainly be some good justification to say, we're full, as you mentioned.
So our next meeting is May 5th, and at that meeting, as I mentioned earlier, we will have some guests from Chittenden East to talk about their experience. It'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So the homework that I mentioned last time is actually the homework for this time. And that it would be a good idea to reread that report. I think some of you may have read it at the beginning, but it would be a good idea to refresh as we get ready for that conversation next week. And then we will also, as I mentioned, have a moderated discussion with Liz Subin, who has offered to come in and help us work through questions about communication and community engagement. So I think that'll be a really lively and productive meeting. Any other homework you want to assign before we call it a night?
No, I think that I want to make sure that the questions we frame for Liz, we make sure that you have before that session so that you can be thinking a little bit about what we talked about. And some of that is who are the community groups. We've talked about a number of different constituent groups, for example, that people might want to engage with, whether it's teachers or community members or parents, school administrators, and so on. So, what's the definition of community, and how would you go about getting the information and getting input from them would be one of those areas. So I'll make sure that we get those to you within the next day or so. And I would just also ask if you would take the time to do that 1 minute right within the next day or two. Again, that information would be very helpful, and it's very helpful feedback for tonight's presenters. And as we go forward, we're in the process of bringing in a kind of a third party to do the financial analysis and cost-benefit ratio that will probably just ratchet up a little bit about what you already heard tonight, but trying to present all that financial information in as simple and layperson terminology as possible when you get to that point of needing. So.
Any other comments before we adjourn? Can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Great. We're adjourned. Thanks so much, everybody.